I'm Carl, and I work for FarmN. FarmN is a carbon services and consulting company focusing on nitrogen-based fertilisers, hydrogen and ammonia value chains. And on behalf of our company, absolutely delighted to see you all here, and thank you so much for coming on such a beautiful day. Today, Molly will start by presenting, thank you to Molly, first of all, for making these workshops happen. Molly works for the Northern and York Landscape Board, part of Landscape SA, and she will talk about how the funding's come about. Then we'll switch over to James, who's a partner with Bentleys SA, to talk about farm economics and nitrogen economics later on in the presentation. And then our Chief Technology Officer, Greg, who really is the brains of this business, it's not me, we'll talk about nitrogen technologies and fertiliser plants and what's happening and how we could potentially look for solutions for regional York Peninsula nitrogen fertiliser plants.
So for those that don't know me, my name's James Allen, a partner at Bentleys SA in the head up the agribusiness side there and national. And a bit of background, so I'm born and bred in the southeast, sort of Lucens Alpinola into Naracoorte. Started on the sheep's back down there, moved into mixed cropping and then into vineyards. And suffice to say, the sheep industry is why I'm an accountant. We can talk about that in the break. So I know a bit about farming systems, and sort of where I've spent a lot of my time is working on the commercialisation and some commercial thinking on that, doing some benchmarking in industry. And the context today with FarmN is to work around the business model and just provide some insight into the thinking around how it might apply on farm and why and how you sort of build it into your operations and what effect it will have. So we'll come back to some of the numbers later, but the first part of the context is just thinking about, what defines farm financial performance, and it's different for every industry or every sort of sector of ag, but predominantly you've obviously got your land, your labour, your plant and equipment, and obviously in the cropping game you've got your seed stock. And what you're looking at is, how do we get the most efficiency, productivity, resilience and utilisation out of all our operational activities, all right? And so the entire industry over the past 20 years, and I think cropping has sort of led some of that ag tech charge, just because probably the doldrums that livestock was in the 90s, and then moving into sort of no-till, bigger kit, bigger farms. Cropping has probably really led the way, as that was probably the easier technological advancement in my view compared to, say, where we are with animal breeding and things like that, which is now starting to take off. And all of that has been around these things, all right? So we've been breeding plants that are more drought resistant and are more water efficient, okay? And I think you definitely have seen that the last few years up here, how that works. We're getting more through soil management, land management, you're getting more carbon in the soil, you're getting more water in the soil, you're getting more resilient crops in variable weather patterns, okay? And across the kit, why are we getting bigger? Why are we running $3-4 million worth of kit across any average farm now? Because we need that size and scale to do those 3,000 to 4,000 acres with one or minimal labour input, right? And the accuracy and the technological advances have been massive, and all of that has led to the industry and particularly in ag trying to control as much as it can, all right? The issue with ag and agribusiness is at any point in time, there's always 50 more things that can go wrong, right? There's all this stuff outside of control, whether international currencies, geopolitics, pricing, you name it, there's a million things that can go wrong. So wherever you see those ag systems work on more control, you'll see more regular output, more reliable systems. So you're thinking like mushrooms, chicken farms, things like that, where everything is controlled, right? The only thing they've got to deal with is the market, because they've got heating, cooling, the whole works. They become closed agricultural systems, and a closed agricultural system is really powerful because you can control as many of those variable factors. And when you limit that, as you know, if you always got the same rainfall, you always got the same everything else, you'd get the same crop every year. It's the fact you can't control that you don't. And long-term financial impact comes from controlling what you can control. The more you add control into particularly an agri, or any business, but particularly an agri system, the more you reduce volatility, and then over time, you're able to achieve higher yields and hopefully lower costs, right? Whether it be through scale or otherwise, okay? And then what we try and then do is, these things actually mean something in the context of your actual financial performance. They actually head to the bottom line, right? So if we can get more consistent yields or higher yields on average with the same or less rainfall, we're going to have higher sales, right? We're going to have more sales. If we're able to do that at a lower variable costs, those are the costs of your inputs. Those are things that go up and down, or should go up and down with the size of your crop. That is urea, sprays and inputs and things like that. Generally speaking, larger crop, you'll put more on there, you've got more to try and lose or try and gain from putting that in there or protecting it. They'll move up and down, fuel, etc. Freight, when you're moving more tons. If we can try and do that more effectively, we have a higher gross profit. And in the world of gross profit, we refer to it as a contribution margin. We call it contribution margin because you need to hit a minimum contribution to get over your overheads, right? These are the fixed costs of running a farm, okay? So those overheads are the things you can't do anything more about, okay? They're going to be there, rain, hail or shine. That is, you're going to get your council rate notice every single year, okay? We do say that fixed. I know they go up sort of all the time, but you know, there's nothing else you can control about that cost, okay? Plant, equipment, sheds and infrastructure, massive costs now on farm, huge, absolutely massive, probably number one in terms of cash flow as well. That cost is fixed, okay? So that $3 or $4 million worth of plant, the whole idea of your operation is to minimise the capital cost per acre of that over the life cycle of that plant. Okay, so you start to think about, you know, should I be buying the new one? How much am I losing on that transfer? Do I get the higher quality second hand? Because at the end of the day, I want to limit the cost between my buy and sell price, because I still have to make that per acre back over the life cycle, right? So we try and control those costs and we try and control them over time. And if we're managing to do that, we're creating more resilience on farm because we've got better and more consistent financial performance from a lower base. Okay, so these things and the context of showing you that model, all right, is it's a constant adaptation. All right, I mean, if you go back 20 years and you think about how you used to sow a crop up here, and there was that annual, I still remember, you know, the annual Channel 9 news cut to the dust drifting down from York Peninsula, getting people's washing dirty in Adelaide, because we were cultivating and ploughing up everything. And after we've done that a few times, we get the harrows out and do it again. You know, if you look at that method development over that 20 years, it's completely chalk and cheese. You wouldn't see a bare paddock here for at all, because there's always stalks in it. So as we do that over time, we've built these systems, and you keep thinking of those little things that can keep squeezing a little bit more out of every part of your business. You get that uptick over time. And certainly the York Peninsula particularly is probably a beacon of that, due to the more consistent returns that you can get up here with the rainfall and the land. And again, probably just relevant up here as well, and some economics, farm economics at the moment have actually lost connection with the output of a farm. And one of the reasons they're losing connection is security. So in agri-financial circles, there's this discussion going on. How do you put the returns on a farm, and how do you value a farm when you're now adding security into the mix of your valuation structure? So what does that mean? It means you're not just looking at inputs, outputs, net profit, and therefore a return on your investment, because often if you were to buy the neighbours here or take a lease out, you're probably heading into a negative cash flow situation. So why are people doing that? Why are people doing that? I think, you know, around here, probably lifestyle choice. Is a good part of the world to farm. You know, you're an hour, 20 minutes to the beach and all that sort of stuff, and close to a city. But apart from that, you need security of supply of land to farm and be efficient at scale. If you lose supply of land, you will immediately lose scale on your fixed costs, being your sheds and infrastructure across the farm. and it becomes unviable very quickly. And so the risky part, you know, that might not happen to, not everyone's exposed because of all the very different financial systems, but that's why sometimes you can justify a large lease to try and build up scale, get your kit up to the right size to look to acquire the property and then lock in long-term supply of land, okay? So, so security is interesting, and then of course we've had the war recently, and we've worked out about, geez, the security of fuel and fert now is somehow back on the table. If we can't access fuel, we can't get the crop in, we can't get the crop off, we can't access fert, we can't get crops to where we want them to be, and we'll come back to the numbers of that soon. You know, and we're locking up a huge amount of money to fund this, right, and to create optionality on farm. And it's quite fascinating, and I always sort of pontificate. You look at, you drive around the regions and you see all the 1950s infrastructure that was all built as a cooperative model, with all the infrastructure being provided by the cooperative as opposed to by each farmer. And now we've moved to a model where every farm is actually providing its own infrastructure, or much more of its infrastructure, in terms of silos, storage, sheds, equipment, freight and transport. Most of that used to be more off, you know, contracted out or shared. Now it's all on farm. And there's good reasons to do that. And one is to create the optionality of having that storage, right? You're not stuck dealing with a Viterra Grain Corp, putting it into the pool, storing all your grain there, having to pay monthly charges. You don't have to take what the pool returns. You can make calls on the market. But the counter to that is you've got to go pay for it, right? You've got to set it up, which takes size and scale. So just some interesting points on that. So you can keep that in the back of your mind as we sort of move into Greg's side of the presentation, and he'll take you through what FarmN are doing and how it sort of fits in.
Thanks, James. So g'day, I'm Greg. So nitrogen fertiliser is a priority. It's obviously substantial, it's volatile, it's a recurring expense, so it's going to be there each year. When it's used to advantage, it's one of those things that can make it profitable. And as James said, at times it can be constrained. However, with conventional nitrogen fertiliser, it's embedded with costs and emissions from manufacturing, transport and use. So what I want to talk today is disrupting the manufacturing, the transport and a little bit about use, but primarily today is about making nitrogen fertiliser rather than using it. So the first fun fact is that all the nitrogen and all the urea that you're paying for, all the nitrogen just comes out of the air. It's either, you know, air in Qatar, or it's air in Canada, or it's air in China, but basically all the nitrogen comes out of the air. So it's a bit like I guess the change to solar power. The sun's providing energy. Wherever the sun was, you could put a solar panel. And if you think about the nitrogen from fertiliser coming out of the air, why can't you just make it anywhere? And that's where we're sort of at and what we want to talk about today. So there's three primarily technology pathways. We're going to talk a little bit about the hydrocarbon pathway because it's the current conventional pathway, and it's just interesting to understand how it's currently made, because when we look at making it from other things like biomass, for example, the whole back end is exactly the same as they do with gas. It's just got a different front end on it. So the risk of acquiring the technology is less than if it's a completely new type of technology. There's also, you can make it directly from electricity. So I'll talk a little bit later, but we're working on a plant at Moree that's using 37 megs of solar and a 41 megawatt battery to do 7,500 tonnes of urea equivalents, but it's not urea, they're actually making anhydrous ammonia because that's what they want to use. But the important point out of that is if you use an electricity only solution, you can't get to urea, you're stuck with ammonia. And ammonia is actually a very limited fertiliser because it burns crops, there's no foliar application with anhydrous. The cotton growers tend to love it, but for southern Australia I don't think it's got a fit because there's no foliar method. And how do you get to soil injection when you've got a canola crop you want to treat late and it's all tangled together? You can barely sweep for a moth in some of those crops, let alone trying to get to the ground with a ground-based application machine. So just a little bit of chemistry here, and those people that have seen me present before know I love this sort of stuff. But nitrogen in the air, N2, two nitrogens joined together, N2, 78% of this room is that gear, okay? And what we're being paid for is nitrogen as protein. And so the blue dots here are embedded in a protein. So farmers are generally paid for carbohydrate if you're growing sugarcane, or protein if you're growing nearly everything else, or a combination of the two. So today we're going to talk about some hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, because this is all in the fertiliser manufacturing, but also in the way fertilisers work in the soil. There's not going to be any test on any of this, so don't worry about it, but just think about it like Lego, okay? So I'm going to try to just present it like pretty simple Lego. This is not meant to be read. This is just showing you all the current different pathways to make nitrogen fertiliser that are available. So there's a lot more there than people think. It's a bit like, again, electricity, coal, nuclear, solar, wind, tidal. There's lots of ways to make electricity, and there's many ways to make nitrogen fertiliser. And in some areas where it's windy, some technologies are going to be better, and in other areas where it's sunny, other technologies are going to be better. Okay, so not all technologies are going to work everywhere. Just something about them. These molecules, people might be aware of water, H2O, and hydrogen. Methane is one carbon with 4 hydrogens. We're going to talk a fair bit about carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide today. And carbon monoxide is a molecule, you might not realise it yet, but to me it's actually the main molecule which makes regional urea making viable. Okay, and we'll talk about why that is in a while. In fertiliser term, there's basically two forms of nitrogen. That nitrogen with hydrogen, so ammonia and ammonium type fertilisers, and urea is a subset of that. Basically that's just two ammonias joined together through carbon dioxide. So that's the residual part of carbon dioxide. That's why you need carbon dioxide to make urea. If you don't have carbon dioxide, you cannot stitch those two ammonias together, and you're just stuck with that. So whether that's urea by itself or UAN, you need to have CO2 to be able to do that. Okay? Or you've got your nitrate forms, and these are the type of forms that something like a plasma type of solution is going to make. Okay? And we'll talk a bit about that specifically. So in terms of global consumption, urea is the big one. It's by far the dominant use. UAN comes in second. And hydrous ammonia is what all of these fertilisers on this list, MAP, DAP, calcium ammonium nitrate, they're all made from ammonia. But ammonia in itself is a very small portion of the market. Sometimes we think it's bigger than it probably is because we see people in Canada with pills and going around and doing it, but it's actually a really small part of the market. But that's what's important though, is it's the first step to making all those other fertilisers. Now, the way it's currently made at the moment, we're just going to step through this. There's a process called steam methane reforming. So if your urea is coming out of Qatar, which most Australian urea does, it's using steam methane reforming, meaning they use natural gas as a feedstock. It has an energy requirement, but what's important about that is 95% of the energy required is in the gas. So the gas is both feedstock to make the fertiliser and the energy in it. It's the cheapest capex to put in at scale in the world at the moment. It has a footprint though, but also what comes out of that is the fossil CO2 to turn that ammonia that's made into urea. But it's going to have a higher footprint because it's a fossil CO2 source. Electrolysis, this green ammonia, that's like the plant in Moree. That's electricity. It has a higher energy input, so you can see compared to the gas, it's significantly higher. But more than that, it requires an extra energy source to provide that. So the energy is in the gas, right? Whereas this actually requires you to put in wind and solar and another cost to make that amount of energy. So, and it's also, its baseline to build it is 2 to 3 times the capex of what the regular plant is. So, and there's no CO2 for urea. So its fit is a small scale type of plant where someone wants to circumvent the supply chain. Because at the moment, the cost of production in Qatar for urea is around 250 to 300 US dollars. So let's call that 400 Australian. That's the cost of production. That's less than half of what you're paying. Most of what you're paying for is freight, handling, margins, profits, and all that sort of thing. So even if it's more expensive for him to do it, he still thinks he can do that cheaper than the supply chain can deliver to him. Okay? Because your cost of production can be higher if it's in a cooperative type of model. And I think these sort of plants, I'm not trying to bring in corporates where you just provide stuff and go buy urea. I'd rather see these plants grower owned as either individual farms or cooperatives depending on the technology. And then you can circumvent that supply chain. Now, what I'm going to talk about near the end of the day, just quickly on coal gasification. It's very much like the steam methane reforming, except they turn coal to gas first. So there's an extra step there, there's extra inefficiency there, and that's why urea out of China has a higher cost of production than out of Qatar. Because out of Qatar they're using natural gas. In China they've got to turn the coal into gas, and then the back end becomes the same, but that extra process is making that slightly more expensive. Has by far the highest footprint though, but again, 95% of the energy that's required is in the coal, right? Compared to say one where it needs some other form of energy. So if we look at biomass gasification, we're doing a very similar thing. So you can just think about biomass being a poor cousin to natural gas and coal in this case. It has an energy demand, but 90% of the energy that's required is in the straw. Okay, so it doesn't need to be powered by a whole lot of other electricity or other things. It does have a higher capex, generally because it's, you know, the poor cousin, it needs more processing before it can go in. If you just got gas, it's pretty easy. Very low footprint, and it has a renewable CO2 for urea. So you can make urea with these products, so you get the product you want to use, but at a much lower footprint as well. In terms of manufacturing and transport, 29% of your footprint in your grain growing is from using the fertiliser, and there's two bits there. There's 31% and 29%, but manufacturing and transport is the 29, and on-farm use is about the 31. So fertiliser use, nitrogen fertiliser use, is about 60% of your current footprint, and about half of that is just getting it to you to have it made and have it moved. I'm just going to hand over to Carl for a couple of slides, because there's a lot happening with nitrogen in the world at the moment, which is going to put a lot of pressure on the supply chain.
Okay, I'm hoping this is going to be interesting. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So, does anyone here know what is the second most produced chemical globally? Or anyone would like to guess? Ammonia. How did you know, Greg? So ammonia is the second most produced chemical globally. And so that amounts to around 200 million tonnes per annum. And 183 million tonnes of that goes towards nitrogen fertilisers. And since about 1980, what we've seen is we reached a point in 1980 where the actual production of ammonia started to go linearly with population growth. So that is, the demand for additional ammonia production is pretty much linked to population growth. But looking forward, that's not what we're going to see. So when we're looking at farming systems and agriculture, we're looking at the nitrogen part of ammonia. But there's three other molecules attached to it. That's hydrogen, and that's a good source of renewable energy. So looking forward to 2050, we're seeing forecasts for demand for ammonia go from around about 200 million tonnes per annum up to something around 700 million. Now, there's a range there that we're expecting to see, but in the shorter term, we know that Japan is going to get up to around 30 million tonnes per annum extra demand for green ammonia in the near future. So they've forecast 500,000 tonnes for 2029, going up to 30 million tonnes. Korea did the same. They had to change of government. So we were looking at 30 million tonnes from them, and if, as is expected, that their new president doesn't get voted in again, that will be 30 million additional tonne potential there. Looking at ocean freight, 300 million tonnes per annum of fossil fuels are used to ship ocean liners around the sea. The International Maritime Organisation has set a net zero framework. When that gets voted in, as it's expected to do in the near future, there will be a price on emissions for ocean freight. And that's all, by the way, driven by private sector. Okay, that the two of the world's biggest ocean freight companies, they're Japanese, they've each got about 1,000 freighters on the sea at any point in time, have already put in orders for over 130, 140 ammonia or dual fuel capable vessels. So renewable ammonia is going to replace fossil fuels going forward. They'll also be looking at biomethanol and biodiesel, and they've also, as a transition fuel, will be using LPG because the emissions are lower, but they're looking to get to net zero by 2050, zero emissions. And they'll be applying an emission tax and using some of that tax to offset the cost of using ammonia. So other companies who are using ammonia will get paid. So that's going to be driving demand, and I guess, is it the next slide? So I guess what we can see is that if we look to the future, what's the price of ammonia and nitrogen fertilisers going to be? Well, it's not going to be just linked to the production of fossil fuel-based ammonia. It's going to start being linked to the additional cost of producing green ammonia. It's going to start meaning that we're going to see more lumpy supply, because it takes years to build a big plant. We get ocean liners coming on board. We get Japan wanting ammonia to co-fire their coal-powered power stations. And as we try and have the supply meet that demand, there'll be scarcity and there'll be, I guess, oversupply for short periods of time. But it'll all be linked to that cost of producing green ammonia. And so I think it would be naive to think that going forward we're going to see anything but continued price increases for the cost of ammonia and lumpy supply, even without closures of the Strait of Hormuz and similar geopolitical issues like we saw in 2020 with Russia invading Ukraine and the halt in supply of Russian fuels. Any questions on that? No.
Is the ammonia drop-in fuel? How's it work through internal combustion?
So ammonia isn't as an efficient fuel as diesel or petrol or anything like that. So it works best in turbine situations, in situations where it's just going constantly, hence ocean freight, hence other forms of turbine electricity production. But what we're seeing in terms of electricity production first is just putting it in with the coal so that they can co-fire. And Japan tested 20% co-firing in April last year, but they're looking to go up to 40% co-firing in their power stations.
So let me just touch on that. It's got quite a high octane, but that's got to do with how things, whether they explode under pressure. It's not necessarily how dense the energy is. So in an internal combustion engine, if you have stuff that's low octane, it's actually exploding on the way up under compression. Right, so then you're actually working against the engine, and that's knocking and all that sort of stuff. When you go to say 98s, they can hold that, and that's why it's less wear, but also then more efficient because you haven't exploded stuff on the way up. And when you go higher than that, what it sort of means actually it's hard to get going, and that's why putting in a turbine where it's already hot, or putting into a like coal-fired power station that's already got the heat there and everything to get it going. So it's not a great fuel for your whippersnipper. You're just going to turn on and do that. But when you have constant demand, it's actually excellent fuel. So this isn't really about its energy. Its energy content is great. And also the airspeed record in the world is held by ammonia fuel and liquid oxygen. So it's actually out there as a fuel, but it's just that it's got such a high octane that it doesn't explode under compression. And so you wouldn't be able to use it, for example, in a diesel engine. You'd go nowhere. Yeah.
Great question. Any others?
Weren't they supposed to be doing nitrogen at Lee Creek?
Yes, but I don't think they'll go ahead at this stage.
Installed bureaucratically, or?
Also, there's another project in Queensland, so they're doing underground gasification, and a thing called Link Energy, and the underground gasification got away, and it ruined the whole water table. Like it was a $1 zillion litigation type of thing.
Yep.
So when you do it underground, if it gets away from you, it can be almost impossible to put out, and I think some of that. So if you want to search Link Energy, LINC I think it is, and see what happened to their underground gasification. But that's actually, would also be very fossil fuel intensive, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. They promoted it like it was going to be green, but it's actually not, because you need CO2 to make ammonia into urea. They were taking their CO2 off of the fossil fuel and then saying, oh, we've got less fossil CO2 coming out. They're actually pushing that liability onto the farmer, because when you add urea to your field, it breaks apart and the CO2 is the first emission. So they were sort of massaging the scopes of where the emissions were coming out, which wasn't quite right in my view. But technically I think they're going to have some trouble going ahead there because of whether they can control it underneath. But also, the company CEO's been let go, and yeah, I don't know, I guess. But I wouldn't be counting on it. The other thing I guess that was a little bit disappointing about that, we had them speak at the Sanford conference some years ago. We said, okay, if we got 400 farmers together and gave you a forward order, could we get a good price? Because they were saying their cost of production was going to be X. We said, can we do X plus percentage to make sense to you? They said, no, we're only interested in selling at maximum market rate. But well, good's that. I mean, wouldn't you rather have, a good offtake agreement locally? But they weren't interested in that. And so, yeah. So if it comes ahead, it's not going to do what potentially a cooperative could do, where then you control your own pricing.
Yeah, it wouldn't matter who did what and where they did it or how they did it. They're always going to be at world parity. So
yeah, unless you've got your own cooperative.
Any other questions about that? Nope. Oh, wrong way. So, if green ammonia is the thing of the ammonia of the future, that extra 400, 500 million tonnes per annum, are there any other advantages that could be seen with green fertiliser? So whether you believe in emissions or not, regardless of that, this is just what's happening. So, as Greg said, up to 30% of the emissions of ag product come from the fertiliser, its manufacture and transport. And 50% of the world's largest fast-moving consumer goods companies have set emission reduction targets. And the next big step change for them is to reduce fertiliser. So we've seen PepsiCo now buying low-emission fertiliser for its farms in Europe. We're working with a project looking to produce low-emission calcium ammonium nitrate in France, and that offtake has been pre-memorandum of understanding for Heineken and In Vivo Foods. Looking in Australia, we can see that Woolworths, Coles, Graincorp and Sunrice all are looking for low-emission products. Looking to the future, Elders, New Farm, Ingham's, Costa Group, Bega Group are all starting to measure what we call their Scope 3 emissions. These are emissions of the agri-products coming in, which is the first step to setting an emission reduction target. So an advantage of having a green fertiliser could be to access these markets going forward. If you export your products, then countries and purchasing groups like the EU and the UK, well, the EU already have it. They've got what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the UK is looking to put one in too. So does everyone know what a border adjustment mechanism is?
Carbon tariff, basically.
Yeah, so it's like saying, do you know what? The EU says we think we want to do something about our emissions, so we're going to start taxing our businesses who are emitting. So all of a sudden, the people producing products in the EU or the UK, their costs go up, and there's the risk of just importing cheaper carbon-intensive products from overseas. So to protect their own industries, they're going to be putting on a carbon border adjustment mechanism or a carbon tax for products coming in. So if you want to access export markets going forward, certainly the EU and the UK and more countries to come, then being able to demonstrate lower emissions will help you get there. We've been speaking to Cargill and we've learnt of their Sustain Cert program, and they pay a premium for low emission farming practices. Okay, any questions about that? Does everyone believe me? No. Tell me, what don't you? I'd be interested to know.
Someone's making a quid out of it, and it's not us.
No, that's true, but all I'm saying is this is going to happen.
Yeah, but what's the government going to do with the money it gets for all its carbon taxes? Fritter away like they're doing now.
So I can't speak to what Australia will do or the EU, but the idea is that by putting that money, they can invest it in low emission production and changing technologies.
You hope.
Oh yeah, I'm not in control. I'm just saying it's happening. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
So what is important? Oh, thanks. I guess what is important about that is that, as Carl said, whether you believe in it or not or you support it, the bottom line is there's incentives for that. Now, the plant in Moree got a $53 million government grant because they were low emissions. And if we want to build a low emissions power plant here, and it might be all about nitrogen fertiliser and security of supply, but the bottom line is you need to follow the rules if you want to get the grant. And that's the lens we want to be thinking through, okay? So FarmN, in conjunction with Gold Standard, which is an international registry based out of Geneva, we've written basically the accounting standards for carbon, that if you were to build a nitrogen power plant, how you would report the carbon intensity. So those rules were applied to the Moree project, and that's what enabled them to help secure their grants, because you've got to be pretty exacting in how that works. So we've got all the accounting, the carbon accounting behind that. And again, that doesn't matter whether you do or don't believe in the emission side of it. It's about, this is a framework out there and there's an opportunity there. And the fact is, the matter is that if we did say biomass to urea, it's going to be renewable. So now just on terms of format, just hang with me for this next little section, and then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to talk about the new techs. But this is a section on old technology, just to understand how your current fertiliser is made, and where we pull out current technology because it's lower risk to use, and apply it to new things, okay? So at the moment, the business as usual for natural gas to make urea is a process called methane reforming, which is basically stripping the hydrogen off of that methane. Remember, methane was one carbon with 4 hydrogens, stripping off the hydrogen. There's something called the water gas shift reaction, which turns the carbon monoxide and lets that strip hydrogen off of water. So you get cheap hydrogen from water by using carbon monoxide. That reaction's been around for over 100 years, very well understood, done at a massive industrial scale, as Carl said, second most made chemical in the world, so we're not doing something that's a high risk, per se. The next one is the Haber-Bosch synthesis. Again, been around for 100 years. All your urea is made by, well, the ammonia to make urea is made by that process. And the theory's always been it's got to be a big scale. But the plant at Moree, the fact they've got that to reach financial close and has been funded by NAB, is funding it, along with the help of the government grant and a few other things, suggests that these scales are becoming less important than maybe they were years ago, and smaller scale deployments of Haber-Bosch can work if you're going to circumvent the supply chain and not be paying $1,000 instead of what its real true cost of production is. Then there's a thing called the Bosch-Meyer synthesis, which is the conversion of urea to ammonia, ammonia to urea, which takes that CO2. These types of plants are around about 1 million tonnes of anhydrous ammonia a year. Just on that, the word anhydrous is nothing special, it just means there's no water in it. So if you had petrol, it'd be anhydrous petrol because there's no water in it. If you had pure alcohol, it'd be anhydrous alcohol. You got whiskey, it's 40% alcohol. So all anhydrous ammonia means it's just pure ammonia. That's it, there's no water in it. Aqua ammonia, which is used by some farming systems, is about 30% pure ammonia with 67% water, okay? But the ammonia in that's still really volatile. You think about a cleaning fluid with ammonia in it's about 5% ammonia and it stinks. So you imagine how much ammonia is just getting out of a spray tank as you're going around the paddock. It'd be stinking. That stink. When people used to say to me, 25 years ago, oh, that cultivation smells so good, I'm thinking, why are you letting all the goodness out? Wouldn't that goodness be better to stay in the soil? But so if you're smelling stuff, it probably means it's being lost. And ammonia, you're going to smell it for sure. So again, just think about this like Lego. You've got your red and your black, which is your oxygen and your carbon, and all these little white guys are the hydrogen. The red and the black come together to form carbon monoxide, and then you've got your hydrogen. So that's your first stripping of the hydrogen out of it, okay? But this is the important reaction, and we're going to talk more about this later, is the carbon monoxide plus water. Just do the Lego thing again. You get carbon dioxide and more hydrogen. So if you're using water, you're basically getting extra hydrogen that's not in the hydrocarbon. And that become evident of why that's important a bit later on. Our nitrogen, again, just use a Lego thing. So you've got some blue Lego, some white Lego, you bust it apart and make 2 of these. That's your ammonia, okay? That's the Haber-Bosch synthesis. If you follow this blue to black to blue and cut out this white, red, white, there's your urea with water left over, okay? So when you make urea, it actually comes out as a slurry. So it's urea with water. Then you take that out and make that into granules, or you could do something else with it. Now, just quickly, in the field, when we actually use urea, the first thing it does is just exactly the opposite. Water gets in there and busts it apart and forms CO2. So that's your first emission. So if that was made out of fossil fuel CO2, then that's going to be a fossil emission. If it was made out of renewable CO2, it's going to be a renewable emission. Okay, so completely different on why the footprint is so different. This is where a urease inhibitor, like NBPT type of inhibitors, that's what they slow down. Okay. The next process, and that is ammonium to nitrate, and that's done by soil biology as well, and your nitrification inhibitors, that's where they work. We're trying to slow down the process to get to nitrate. You can read that another time because you're going to get the slides. But when I mentioned before that oxygen was a lot of it on Earth, most people think of oxygen being in the air. That is next to nothing. That's like less than 1% of the oxygen on Earth. Water, H2O, there's a lot more oxygen in water than there is in the air, but the big one is rocks. So everyone know limestone around here, right? Calcium carbonate, 1 unit of calcium, 1 of carbon, and 3 of oxygen. People don't look at limestone and go, oh, it's mostly oxygen, but it actually is. Sand is 2/3 oxygen. So basically the crust of the Earth, iron ore, it's iron oxide. Bauxite, it's aluminium oxide. They're all oxides, zinc oxide. Everything we're getting, in our industries to make metals are all oxides. So there's all this oxygen around. In a soil, oxygen tends to get a negative polarity to it, so it gets a bit of a negative charge. And because there's so much of it in the soil, that's actually what your cation exchange capacity is. So if anyone's seen a soil test with cation exchange capacity on it, might be 12 or 20 or whatever, it's actually the surface area of oxygen that's exposed to the soil solution. And what happens is that ammonium, because it's positively charged, sticks to that. Whereas nitrate that's negatively charged is repelled from that. 2 negatives repelled, like 2 north poles. So nitrate is really easy for the plant to pick up because it's not stuck to anything. Okay, so imagine like a paperclip and a really strong magnet. The paperclip's out here, you just pick it up. If it's stuck to the magnet, you've got to pull it off. So for wheat, it takes up about 6% or so of its nitrogen as ammonium and about 94% as nitrate because it's so much easier to get it. But also because it's repelled from the soil solution, it's why it's highly vulnerable to leaching. And so if you do a deep end test, your nitrogen bulb is generally going to be where your wetting front finishes. So if you've ever seen salt dam going up a wall and then you've got the salt at the top, turn that upside down, that's your nitrate leaching, and where your nitrogen bulb's going to be is where your wetting front finishes, because the nitrate's going to move down. Now, the other way other than leaching that you lose nitrogen out of the soil, your ammonium in the soil is extremely secure, but your nitrate is very vulnerable, both from leaching, but the other one, I don't know whose paddock this is. This is a photo I took years ago as a bad example of working too much and getting it wet, right? There's anaerobic condition, you might have heard of that. All that really means is all the soil microbes in there are drowning. They can't get any air because it's no porosity, there's no air, it's just all waterlogged. So all these critters down here are having a drown. They want oxygen. So they say, oh, nitrate's got lots of oxygen on it. I'll pull an oxygen off of nitrate and turn it into this critter. And some other critter says, oh, there's still some oxygen there, I'll get that. When you form this one though, that's a gas and that leaves your system. It'll just go out of the soil as a gas and go. This is the next one. You see it's changed the ratio. So here's 1 nitrogen to 2 oxygen. This is 2 nitrogens to 1 oxygen. So they've stripped more oxygen out of that, okay, to make that molecule. This is called nitrous oxide. That leaves the soil as a gas as well. But that's the gas that everyone says is 300 times the power of CO2, okay? Put that aside, you're actually still losing your nitrogen. If it's so anaerobic for so long, then they'll strip that and go to N gas, like N2, back to the air, just as it originally was. So that's why nitrate's vulnerable to leaching, because it's negatively charged, and why it's vulnerable to forming gas and off-gassing and leaving the system because in anaerobic condition. So for example, if you were to be using a plasma machine, like a plasma leap or a green lightning sort of thing, which primarily make nitrates, if you put it onto that soil there, they're going to just go. Those critters are hungry for that oxygen. That's going to happen pretty fast and it's just going to go. Whereas if you added urea, I wouldn't be recommending, adding urea to that soil, but the point is, if you add urea, you're slowing that process down to the nitrate. But because it's highly available, by drip feeding that nitrate along, means the plants can take it up before it leaches or before it forms a gas. So that's the idea behind the inhibitors of that. So the first of the emerging technologies we're going to talk about is non-thermal plasma. And basically, sort of a few years ago, coined a term when we did a project on this before pre-commercial, lightning in a bottle. So it's not really like lightning, but people relate to that, so we'll work with that for the time being. Now, don't worry too much about these numbers, but this is basically the energy that's required to make nitrogen. If you've got nitrogen in the air and you want to make it into a form of fertiliser, what's the energy that actually takes to do that? And that can be a surrogate of how viable it may or may not be. So theoretical energy for ammonia out of Haber-Bosch is 7 kilowatts per kilo of actual N. So we're only talking N units here, not specific fertilisers. When it was invented and first deployed, like in the 20s, 30s and that sort of thing, it was about 34. So they're quite a long way off the theoretical efficiency. This is a chemist on a bit of paper, right? No one ever's going to reach that. It's like diesel efficiency should be 83%, but we're struggling to get 40, right? That's where it's at. But over the last 100 years, we've got to 10, which is really close to 7. So that's a pretty amazing feat to get that efficient. But given it's the world's second most made chemical over 100 years, people have been trying to make it more efficient. But I don't think we're going to see much more efficiency because it's reached that sort of case of diminishing returns now. If you look at non-thermal plasma for ammonia, so Plasma Leap has a system that does that. Their current figure is around 24, and that's, I think, pretty credible. Okay, so it's currently off the pace, but it's not out of the ballpark. But it hasn't been around for 100 years. It's been around for like 3 years, 5 years, sort of thing. So how can they make it better? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. When we look at nitrate output, lightning takes about 40,000 units of energy because it's also making light and heat and noise, and it's extremely inefficient. And that's why the analogy of lightning in a bottle is actually not that true, because this is using brute force. Rather than using the key to get in the door, this smashes it down with a sledgehammer. All right? So it's about, let's call it 3 to 7 kilos of fixed nitrogen per lightning bolt. Okay? The theoretical efficiency of non-thermal plasma to make nitrate is actually 4. So it's not quite half of ammonia, but in theory it's actually the most efficient way that humans know of at the moment to take nitrogen out of its air form and make it into a fertiliser form. So it is the most efficient. But at the moment, people are saying optimistically to be competitive with a nitric acid plant, you probably need to be less than 20. And the technology at the moment is probably around 40. Okay? So it's theoretically, it could be fantastic. This is like, I guess, the first generation of tech. And if you think back how good a light bar GPS was and what it looks like today, things can change over time. So when we did our project here, this is at a winery at Kultala, and this is all pre-commercial green lightnings, plasma leap sort of stuff. This is just getting a raw plasma arc and doing it ourselves, basically. And that's what it looks like inside the machine, in effect. It's so our little mini lightnings, but very targeted at specifically trying to hit the right frequency that makes nitrogen dissociate. So rather than a brute force, we're trying to use that lock and key sort of mechanism. My primary learnings out of that was that if the peripheries fail, it can be really costly. So an air compressor that stops working, a relatively cheap air compressor, can cost you thousands of dollars in something that's more expensive. Sometimes if something's breaking and it's just out by itself, no one really cares. But if another subsystem relies on that, it's very expensive. So water pumps, if that's running and it runs out of water, so what we did with ours when it ran out of air was this thing actually basically burnt out and all this stuff cracked. So it was a pretty expensive thing for a cheap air compressor. So when you're looking at, if you're thinking about investigating these types of machines, make sure that the peripherals They're not just using, the cheaper sort of compressors and pumps and stuff like that. Look into that detail, because if they do fail, your core equipment is going to be at risk. The other one is the actual liquid itself. A couple of things came out of that. It was very low nitrogen concentration on its own. It was lower than I guess we'd sort of hoped and expected for, but it was definitely there. But it makes quite a large liquid volume. And because we didn't know what we were doing at the time, we had it in an IBC that had light coming in, and it was in a shed that was warm. We came back one day and it was like algae city. Like all the internal lines are covered in algae. So if you've got UAN, it doesn't grow algae, but this is at a concentration low enough that it's great for an algal bloom if it gets hot. So you don't want it to touch light, don't want it to get hot, those sort of things. So your storage is important. Now, the other thing in that too is, remember when I said there's these other nitrates over here that a plasma machine makes, and one of them was NO2 negative, okay? That actually can turn to an off gas as NO as well. So what happens is a part of your solution is going to be that, and if you have it in an enclosed or more enclosed container, as it builds up in the headspace, it'll stop more formation of that. It's called chemical equilibrium. It's a bit like a pendulum. The further you go, the more it wants to pull back. So as you increase the concentration of that off gas in the headroom, you'll slow that reaction down. But if you've got an open container or a vented container, that stuff will go and it won't reach a concentration point to force the reaction. It'll just keep on going out. So you can lose some stuff there. So is black the right way to go? If it's in the shade, maybe, I guess. But yeah, sunlight, closed container, all that sort of stuff. And at a 1%, 2% solution, it's a lot of liquid to be storing as well. So what we find when we just run a basic system is we get our nitrate, which is primarily what's formed mostly. You get a little bit of NH4. This is where some of the hydrogen's being pulled off of water in that lightning arc. Okay, so you get a little bit of that. But this is an interesting one, which is hydrogen peroxide. Now, where we've had a look at some of these systems, there's some that are in pretty high rainfall zones. There's one down at Werribee, and that farmer actually has a contract with the Werribee wastewater treatment plant to take all of their water. So he's in a high rainfall zone. He's contracted to take an absolute shitload of water. So he's often got a lot of water lying around. And what do we know about anaerobic condition? It's not great for plants to grow, and it's not great for fertiliser use and stuff. But this is what's called an oxidising agent. So you remember the critters would want to pull oxygen off? This basically pushes it to them and just forms water. So instead of being H2O2, it would go to H2O, and you're liberating an oxygen. So one of the reasons I think this is also working reasonably well in the wetter conditions is potentially that it's producing hydrogen peroxide as well. If you look at the USDA and search for hydrogen peroxide as a foliar spray, it's also used a lot in horticulture for controlling root foliar disease at low concentrations. And where you're going to get foliar disease? When it's wet and those sort of things as well. So I'm wondering if that's, in addition to a fertiliser effect, whether it's got a therapeutic effect. And I think the feeling we've been getting from people is that we're not convinced that the nitrogen's there, but the solution's doing something. And it's probably doing more than what the nitrogen suggests. But we don't know the full mechanism, but I think that hydrogen peroxide has something to do with it. Okay? So what we also did is, if you think about these machines at the moment, if they're running multiple heads, they're generally running in parallel and everything's just going through once. What we wanted to research is, what if you actually recycle this solution? Can you, instead of it being a low concentration, can we increase the concentration? Or is that machine running it through the lightning again going to destroy as much as you've made? So this is just a batch, so basically the arc sitting in a beaker and running for 20 minutes. And this is the nitrogen that it's made in that time. And this is just the N, elemental N per minute. So 3.3 units of N and 20 minutes. So N per minute is 1.65. Oh, let's call it 165 just to keep it easy. When we recycled that water, so instead of having going through once, we actually recycled it through again. In 20 minutes, we made a significant amount of more nitrogen. So we're at, 165 to 290. That's not double, but it's 40%. It's a pretty significant increase. That's not just the recycling. Apparently, it seems like the agitation through that and having some of the ions in is helping that happen. If we did it for an hour, we went to 210. So we actually dropped a bit. So our recycling efficiency is some sort of curve in there where it picks up from nothing and it peaks, and then you just keep recycling it forever, it's going to go down. the exact volume of that's going to depend on your storage container. Because if it's like a 2 litre container or a 1,000 litre shuttle or a 50,000 litre tank, the time it takes to recycle and all that sort of stuff's going to be different. What this tells me is also there's potentially a technology improvement here is to put the arcs in series. So the first one comes through and then it hits the second one, then hits the third one. So increase the flow rate, but do them in series through multiple arcs rather than doing in parallel. All right, so there could be some sort of technical increase, but off the bat, we've gone from, a pretty 40% increase just by the way we operate the machine. Okay, so is that worth something? Probably. I mean, these are the small increments that get us from, 40 towards that 4, and it's going to take a while. This is another piece of work we did in conjunction with the Hessel Research Group, and Volker Hessel here in Adelaide is one of the world's leading guys on this sort of stuff, and they have these guys here, Nam and Champing. He's a doctor in this sort of stuff, and Champing's doing his PhD in this. These guys are in Adelaide, and so there are resources there locally. But what we did here is, instead of just using normal water in one of those plain arcs or whatever you want to call it, is we introduced a catalyst. And if you look at nearly every industrial process, they all use catalysts to improve efficiency. And we've gone from a solution there of 84 up to 118, so another 40% increase. So if you take the analogy of solar 35 years ago, where 1 kilowatt panel was this big, and if a little bit got shaded, the whole thing didn't work and there was no batteries or whatever, to where we are today, there's been a lot of improvement. This is on the same trajectory. It's going to take some time. And I guess my point of view is that I think that some of the companies have overstated the nitrogen production. They're not doing a good service to themselves or the industry as a whole. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. There's lots of room for improvement. And is that hydrogen peroxide doing something as well? And if it's able to substitute nitrogen for the time being while improvement happens, I think it's really a technology to keep your eye on. And I think the people that have lashed out and bought one should be admired and praised for helping us to understand how they work now, what they're looking like, and help us to get into this space. Like the first people that started using a disc seeder or a tine seeder, oh yeah, crazy, not ripping it up. But someone had to do it to break the ice, and then we could go from there, improve from there to what farming systems look like today. So there's a bunch of companies now, both in Australia and around the world, that are doing it. For these guys up here, we're currently doing a complete audit of their system, which will turn out nitrogen per kilowatt exactly. So it won't be someone making it up and saying, because one of the marketing things is this replaces this much urea. It doesn't say how much nitrogen it's making, it's this replaces something. We actually want to get to the bottom of the actual nitrogen use efficiency of this in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of kilowatt to N, because that's what really matters. Whether you get your kilowatts out of the grid or out of your own wind turbine or whatever, kilowatts to N is still going to be the key measure that we want to get to. The next technology, so we're just going to change tack now. If there's any questions on the plasma stuff, more than happy to answer them later or now. I'll just keep going.
What was the catalyst you used?
Yeah. So, and it was actually just an iron catalyst, very cheap, readily available, cheap industrial catalyst that's people can buy now really cheaply. So nothing, nothing fancy, unobtainium sort of stuff. It was.
Catalysts they put in some of these things cost more than the stuff.
Yeah, and that was what the research is, because it's things like this that sometimes researchers get carried away with cost. You've got to think about farm adoption. So let's think about doing stuff that are low cost, already existing in the market, that sort of thing. So yeah, it was literally one of the cheapest iron catalysts you can get. Can we do better catalysts? Probably. But if we can get 40% out of the cheapest thing we can find, well, that's a good start, I guess. So yeah, so it was just an iron oxide type catalyst. Yep.
Greg, do you know, once you make this nitrate out of plasma reaction,
Yep.
How long does it stay in there? Like, is it likely to just go back in the air once you get it out of a sealed vessel, or what, is there any time?
So, sorry, I'm just going right back here, right? So when this is formed, nitric oxide, you remember when we did the critters eating the oxygen? This is one of the gases. You won't hold this no matter what. That's going to go, right? That's just going to bubble out the system and get through any nook and cranny, even if it's like a a partial flat valve or something like that, that's a gas and it's going to go. This one here is in solution as a negative charge, but in acidic conditions, it goes to a H plus with this to become HNO2, and that can break down to this gas. All right, so then that goes to this guy here, which then will escape. That's going to be driven by the concentration of that you make, and then also whether it's contained. So when I was talking about the headroom in the tank, if you have enclosed headroom, you will build up the concentration of this gas, even though some's still escaping, but it will still increase the concentration, which will slow down the reaction of this forming that chemical equilibrium is going to cut in. So, but if you just had that in an open tray, then this reaction is going to happen and that's going to go off and it's just going to keep driving it through. So it will leave the system. Once you've got your nitrate, because some of this will also go to that as well through oxidation. So it's not that it's all going to this, a lot of it goes to that and some will go to this. Once you have the actual nitrate, that's not going anywhere. That's very stable, no worries at all. It's only this guy here. Now, when we look at the, this gives us like slightly better breakdown of that there. So when we did the batch one, we had none of it. When we did the longer recycling, we had a very small percentage, only 2% of the N was that form. But when we did, even though we made the most N there, that was 14%. So that's more vulnerable to loss than this one, but you're making more N total. And so there's going to be some sort of sweet spot in saying, where do we make this solution that peaks N, but minimises that? So that NO2 negative is your main risk for off-gassing in that system.
So when we were started using this green lightning machine, it was filling up like 330 litres a day it was making of solution, and we were constantly draining that into a 25,000 litre tank, and we were producing bugger all nitrogen. And then they said, leave it in the tote for 3 days, like don't empty it every day, like empty it when it's full.
Mm-hmm.
And then the concentration of N went up like twofold, like it doubled, just because we have no headroom, or it was left in that container that was fully sealed, I suppose, under the green light machine for a couple of days longer.
Yep.
So that was that NO2 converting into NO3, was it?
Yes. Yeah. So when you, sorry mate, I'm just going a bit too far there. Oh, I don't know where it went, but yeah, the bottom line is if you keep the headroom low, the chemical equilibrium is going to push across that path, and what it will pick up is the other path. The other interesting thing I'd like to look at that I haven't looked at but I think would work is having an air bubbler bubbling through it. That'll provide the oxygen to help drive that reaction. So that reaction wants oxygen. So by increasing the oxygen concentration in the solution, how you do that in something that's got a headroom capacity and you're putting air in there, I don't know, right? But if somehow we get more oxygen in there, that would also help drive that vulnerable form through to your nitrate form. So chemistry-wise, easy, practicality a bit harder. All right. So thanks for the question. The next one we're going to look at is the basic technology that's being used on that Moree fertiliser project. This is where we get water and use electrolysis. So again, just using our Lego, the two red ones, we take the water apart and we make oxygen and the two hydrogens from each end, okay? It takes a lot of energy to do that, and again, that's from a third-party energy supply. That's why it's quite expensive to do. But beyond there, it's exactly the same. We just use the Haber-Bosch process to turn that hydrogen and nitrogen out of the air into ammonia. But that's as far as this reaction can go because we don't have CO2 on site. And that's why I'm a bit reluctant that this is a great solution. I think this is a watershed for the industry to see a farmer in Australia build his own plant that makes all his own conventional synthetic nitrogen fertiliser is a watershed for the industry, no doubt. The fact it doesn't suit our farming system, okay, I can live with that, but this is about examples of what can happen, I think. So, as I said, he's used to using anhydrous type products. He loves them. These are the numbers. So 36 megawatt solar plant, 41 megawatt battery up there, and then electrolyzer, which is just the machine that takes water and spits out the oxygen and hydrogen using the stuff. So at the end of the day, 4,500 tonnes per annum of anhydrous ammonia. So the equivalent of about 7,500 tonnes of urea. So he wants to use 80-90% of that himself. In a good year, he'll use it all. In a lean year, he'll sell some. This is a different project, but using the same tech. So this is in Paraguay. And a few things about this project are really important. I think you need 3 things to have a successful project. You need the feedstock, whether it's natural gas or trees or whatever, you need a feedstock. You need a machine that's going to work, and you've got to have an offtake. So who's going to pay or use that product? You need those 3 things. When you look at this project, it has all of them. So what they did is, this is off a dam, and okay, we don't have a dam on the York Peninsula, but again, the principle's the same. They got a long-term baseload electrical. So the difference between wind and solar being intermittent and hydro being baseload, even though it's renewable, is great for what they want to do. They're going to run the electrolyser. So with technology, they've got a fixed price lump sum contract to have it built. So instead of going for a contract open-ended and this can happen, that can happen, they decided to have a premium on that. So it's probably about 10% premium, but they know exactly what they're getting. And for that reason, it makes it sort of more bankable as a new installation because it's managing risk for price. Offtake agreement, 260,000 tonnes a year of calcium ammonium nitrate, all bought by Yara already, all gone. So that's Yara, as people might be aware, one of the largest fertiliser companies in the world. They're taking the lot. What's also important about this is that the finance to get that money was 5 times oversubscribed. Now, you can argue that that was because some people needed to hit some carbon targets. You could argue it was because it represented good value or whatever. But if something's 5 times oversubscribed, it says to me that there's probably something in it, okay? So, yeah, that would be the equivalent in urea terms of about 150,000 tonnes of urea a year out of that plant. But they're not making urea because they can't. And it's always important to remember that they can only make ammonia. If you have ammonia, you can make a calcium ammonium nitrate, or you can make ammonium nitrate. But you can't make urea or urea ammonium nitrate. Okay. Fertiliser project in France, using a renewable grid that's baseload underpinned by nuke, with some wind in it as well. Double the size of the Paraguay project, 500,000 tonnes of calcium ammonium nitrate. That's the one Carl was mentioning that Vivo Foods and Heineken are basically progressing. Calcium ammonium nitrate is great for apples because calcium sits inside the cell walls and keeps things nice and firm. When you have too much soft growth from nitrogen, you can have issues with apples. So they love, and I guess Heineken own, apple cider companies and all that sort of thing. So that's where we think that's probably going, is into that market. The one thing I did want to talk about today is the pathway of biomass to urea. So straw to urea, wood to urea, whatever. So we just think about them like a poor cousin of coal or gas. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about this is that people that know me know I've been on to stubble retention for ages and how important it is, and controlling erosion, soil health, all the rest of it. I get it, right? I get it. And I wouldn't be promoting this if I thought it was unsustainable. But the fact of the matter is it's going to take some straw. It really is how much straw to how much urea. If I could do a gram of straw and get 10 tonnes of urea, I'd do it every day. If it's 30,000 tonnes of straw to get 1 gram of urea, I'm never going to do it. So it's that ratio that matters. That's what we want to get to and talk about. So things like shells and husks and stuff like that, they're often already brought to a site. So if you've got almonds, they're already brought there, and all the almond husks are sitting there doing not much. So you don't have a separate operation to go and get it, to transport. It's already been covered in the cost. When we look at straw, it requires closer evaluation because you've got both the transport perspective, the whole operation of baling, etc., the opportunity cost of erosion, those sort of things, in addition to things like non-uniform feedstocks in this technology are more capitally intensive. Now there's plants, I'm going to show a couple of examples of plants that also are doing biomass, but they're also including things like urban organic waste and urban municipal waste and stuff like that, which have plastics in them. That usually increases the yield of urea, but it also usually increases the capex. So for a sec, if you imagine like a barbecue grill and you've got your flames underneath the grill, and you put a stick on it, the stick's going to burn, but it's largely going to hold its shape. It's going to sit there and just burn until it's ash and fall through. But if you put a bit of plastic on there, it's just going to melt through there and catch on fire, right? So the type of machine you buy is going to be completely different for something that holds its shape versus something that melts. If you want to do both of them in the same machine as a mixed waste, it's going to cost you more to build that. That's just a fact, right? So the other one about what I don't like about the waste, I'm going to talk about this in a sec, is that what's left over after this process is your ash, and what's in that ash is your calcium, magnesium, zinc, moly, phosphorus, whatever, the things that aren't being used into making urea, they're all in there. If you do it with a waste stream rather than say a straw stream, if it's all straw, you know it's all clean. If you do waste, suddenly you've got CCA in there, in your ash you've got arsenic and cadmium, and someone else puts batteries and lead paint and shit like that in there. Do we want to see that stuff go back on farm? Because the ash itself, we can granulate and provide that back as a separate granule of trace element type fertiliser. But if you include waste, you think, oh, we're going to make some more urea, but you're excluding the ash. So I'm not saying one's right or wrong, I'm just saying one's a higher capex with other risks. Here's me on Trevor Polkinghorn's old place, stubble work, Kapunda looking at stripper fronts and stuff like that. So I love my straw, and I think it is, the key of sustainability. Nonetheless, biomass, you might remember methane was CH4. Biomass is C, H1.6 with a bit of oxygen in it. And this is where the water-gas shift reaction is going to come to be very important, because when we strip the hydrogen out, we're only going to get 1.6 hydrogen rather than 4. But we're going to get a shitload of CO. So we're going to use water to make a lot more hydrogen out of that. So the water-gas shift reaction is much more important in biomass than anything else, and I'll show you why that is. This is a separate technology, just for a sec, which uses biomass, but it doesn't use the lignin. It can only use the cellulose and the hemicellulose, and it's basically like a biology that eats the straw and burps out hydrogen. That's how that sort of works. They're aiming for 30 kilos of hydrogen per tonne of straw. We sent them some barley chaff, some lentils chaff, and we were getting like 22 and 11. So it's got a ways to go. I like the technology, but it's new, interesting, but got a little ways to go. When we do something like gasification or thermolysis, that uses all the plant except the ash. So cellulose, hemicellulose and lignin are all available to this technology to strip the hydrogen off. So again, we're just going to make our syngas, which is our carbon monoxide and our hydrogen, run that through the water-gas shift reaction, same old Haber-Bosch process, same old urea synthesis off the shelf. But in this tech, scale matters. This is me in Spain about, when I still had a brown beard, and straw going in. This plant's doing about 125,000 tonnes a year, but it's only doing energy, like electricity, right? But the point is the front end loading of handling and making bales and being able to put them into an energy machine, that's all worked out. And the back end of taking syngas and doing the water-gas shift reaction, ammonia and urea is all worked out. We just have this space of uncertainty around taking the straw and making it into a suitable gas. Now, that water-gas shift reaction, and I'm raving on about this, but over the next slide I'll show why it's important. Again, our Lego produces the CO2 and the hydrogen. In 1 tonne of baled straw at say 10% moisture, you've got about 60 kilos of actual hydrogen in there that's available for you to get out. So if you use a direct extraction technique that's going to strip the hydrogen out, you're only ever going to get less than 60 kilos, because there's only 60 kilos in there. So you're going to end up with 30, 40, 50 or whatever it is, but it's always going to be less than 60. By using the carbon monoxide and the water-gas shift reaction, we're up over 100. So we more than double the hydrogen supply out of exactly the same 1 tonne of straw. So if you're going to say, okay, straw is important to my farming system, and I'm going to use biomass to make urea, surely you're going to choose a system that makes 3 times as much hydrogen, because that's going to directly be proportional to the ammonia and then to the urea you make. Okay, so that's why this water-gas shift reaction is so important, because it more than doubles your fertiliser output. And when we look at the water, if we will produce a straw plant doing, say, 200,000 tonnes a year of straw, I've put a conservative estimate. I'm going to show some actual numbers of plants that are being proposed at the moment in a sec, but I'm technology optimistic, but I'm always conservative in trying to say what's going to happen. I'm just, I'd like to be better when we deliver than overstate the case. But the water required to run the water gas shift reaction is about 3 tonnes of water per tonne of urea output. At current connection and usage rates through SA Water, it's $9.96. I'd take $10 of water to make a tonne of urea every day of the week. So looking at actual plant now and stuff, this type of making gases out of biomass has been around for years and years and years. 1943, Germans fell short of being able to hold on to their oil fields in Russia. They had to fall back on wood-producing engines. So people know about using wood-producing wood gas. That's exactly the same syngas that we'd make into urea. It's just that this time it's being sent to an internal combustion engine and burnt rather than being used as a chemical processing fuel. This is a biomass gasifier making syngas in Finland. And this is a pretty dynamic space, and what we're seeing now come out, these modular forms to do these types of processes that actually have the water gas shift reaction all included in them already. Okay, so we're starting to see good advancement in this space. Now there's currently 2 projects in Australia. We've done some work on this one, and Carl met with these guys in Queensland last week at the Ammonia Energy Association conference. Now I just want to show you these numbers. They're talking about taking 265,000 tonnes of what they're calling abundant carbon resource streams. Shitty old wood, some straw. It's at Gladstone, so they've got some reject coal or whatever else, but primarily it's just carbon resources. With that 265,000 tonnes of resources, they want to make 220,000 tonnes of urea. It's all being pre-bought on a 10 by 10 agreement for AdBlue. All right, so all done. Like I was saying before, you want an offtake agreement, they've got it. Now that ratio of input to urea sits at about 83% conversion. All right, so if you divide 220 by 265, you get about 83%. Okay. My current number is sitting at 25% from, we'll get there and why that is. But this place here, which is the Riverbend project down at Tailem Bend, that wants to do a similar thing, and their claim is to do 120,000 tonnes of biomass, which is coming from 3 sources: some local straw, peat soil's overburden that it can't compost, so it's probably some hard woods that don't compost and some plastic and shit like that, and West Torrens City Council's waste. All right, so he's decided to go down that track, but he wants to do this project's proposing 100,000 tonnes of urea from 120,000 tonnes of biomass, 83% conversion ratio, exactly the same as the other project. Both of these projects state the technology they're going to use. Okay, so we think it's looking real. They're pretty significant numbers, I think. And again, sort of what you get out of that is the ash, so some zinc and whatever else. I'll just skip over that, but that's what's going to be left over, and it has agronomic value as well. So I've made this up, and I'm happy to hear some feedback what you think about these numbers, because we want to have this as a feedback workshop. But if you were to apply 150 kilos of urea to a crop, whether that's split application or whatever, we're saying that maybe you'd get 3.5 tonnes of grain and 5 tonnes of straw. As an increment, does that sort of sound about right? That's okay with everyone? It's not out of the ballpark? No? Okay. So if we use that, and we were going to say cut 4 tonnes of straw and leave a tonne of residue behind, our conversion ratio I'm using here is 25%. Remember those other published ones are 83. So this is about a third or less conversion. So this is like the worst, not the worst case scenario potentially, but it's a very achievable scenario that's probably got a lot of headroom by 2 or 3 times. So if urea at 150 kilos, if you've got 1 tonne of urea, you're going to do about 6.7 hectares of stuff at 150 kilos, which means that to service 7 hectares of fertiliser, you're baling 4 tonnes off 1 hectare. Okay. Now, if our 83%, if we can get 83% rather than 25, that's half or a third of that. So if you start to think about baling 2 tonnes or something like that, it starts to, I think, starts to get pretty compelling, because you're baling like a 12th or a 15th of the farm to get all the fertiliser for the whole farm. Now, we need to do the work to get, flesh out these numbers and publish them in a format that we totally agree with and would support in an environment like this where we're only going to use, say, wheat straw. Okay, so we need to do that work, and we haven't done that yet. So I can only use other numbers from other published projects, but they're pretty similar in the way they're going. These 50,000 tonnes of straw input and 100,000 tonnes of straw input, in terms of economy of scale, are going to be extremely expensive to build, high capital cost. There's very big economy of scale in this process. This is a sweet spot, I think, because if you go too much more, your catchment area gets too big and suddenly you're driving hundreds of Ks and all that sort of stuff. It's going to come down to the intensity of where you can get that catchment from and how far people have to drive. But let's say that this 150,000 tonne plant's going to produce 37,500 tonnes of urea. That'll service at 250,000 hectares. Okay, that 150 kilos. Great if we could do double that or triple that, but that's a number to work with as a conservative estimate. So that straw is giving you all the material to make the fertiliser to get for the nitrogen out of the air, plus about 93% of your energy. So you will need a little bit of extra electricity, but it's bugger all in the context of things. So I guess what we're looking at is to say, okay, if you want to go go buy your own plasma machine on farm, you can go do that. That's cool. But if we want to look at this ain't going to work at farm scale. I don't know how big you have to be to make this work in your own farm, but it's too big, I think. So if we would have a community model, I've just called it the Northern York Fert Co-op, for example. You take your 2 tonnes or 4 tonnes of straw in there, and James is going to talk a little bit in a minute about what we see. There's 2 things. There's the actual cost of baling and moving that, and then there's your opportunity cost, which is a bit harder. Is this $40 or is it $150? Having known farmers for long enough, when they want to buy straw, it's $10, and when they want to sell it, it's $500, right? But this is about being transparent to your own business model. Because if you say, oh, I want $500 for my straw, the economics ain't going to work and the project will never get up. If you say, oh, I want $2 for my straw, you're going to be out of pocket, right? So what we really want to find to be able to do a proper scoping study on this is what you truly believe your own straw baling plus opportunity cost, what it really is. Is it $100? Is it $80? Is it $120? Whatever it is, because you're going to go to this co-op and trade in your straw and take urea away on different days in different trucks. But that's the bottom line, okay? So what we want to find out here is what's the realistic opportunity cost for that straw and what's the cost plus, because that's giving you most of your energy and your material, but it's not actually paying the capex, opex, the wages, whatever else of that plant. So it would need some money. So it's a straw plus model. Now, I guess my feeling is if that's $2, everyone's doing it, and if it's $20,000, no one's doing it. But what if it's 200? What if it's 400? What if it's 600, 800? Where does that balance fit with a few tonnes of straw and some cash? What makes sense to have your own plant as a cooperative with long-term supply, get off the roundabout of prices are going up next month if you don't order and all that sort of stuff. So realistically, what that's going to rely on is participation, because if one dude at Yorktown wants to do it and one guy north of Kadina wants to do it, it's not going to happen. It's got to be about participation, and that's sort of what the conversation we want to start off today is. Does this look interesting to you guys? And if so, how do we increase the exposure to this type of stuff so that we can get the participation, that we can actually go out and do a proper pre-feasibility study to say, this is actually the real cost. Because at the moment, the people that build these plants are not interested in tyre kickers that ring up. Oh, look, what does the straw to urea plant cost? They have no interest in that. They've got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of work. If we went to them and say, hey, we've got a group of farmers together, we're serious about this, here's our analysis on the straw, and here's a couple of grand for your own time, we want to know exactly what it's going to cost to build on this spec straw. We can get that number. It's going to take some time and resource and money to get it done though. But that's where I think we need to get to, because we can't just say, oh, the dudes in Queensland are doing it for this price, because there's different feedstock. All right, any questions about that? Because I'm going to just hand back to James now.
There was a fellow a couple of years ago that was going to build one of these biomass plants at our Ross's.
Yep.
What's all happened with that? Everyone got excited and
Yeah,
he was out for tenders and everyone said how much straw they'd give him. And
Yeah, so I got to about 40,000 tonne and sort of peaked out. And what that was, because I was pretty close to that project, so I was with Sanford at the time, and I guess it was like, these guys know electricity. We don't want to think the straw is worth nothing. Get involved and let's see what happens, right? So that was good. What the way I read the system was that people that were already baling had lots of straw to store it as a different market to diversify. So if the chicken litter, the chicken bedding market dried up, they'd have something else to go to. And they were willing to apportion some of their straw to that. The people that weren't baling at all probably weren't that interested. And the main reason for that was it was just a corporate play, in effect, where you were just going to sell straw, and it could have might as well been to a horse farm or a mushroom farm or a chicken farm or whatever. It was just another way of selling straw. I think the major difference in this proposal is that it's actually a turnkey solution for something that comes in, back into your own farm, which is a major cost, a recurring cost, and of something that's hard to get from time to time, and it's one of your keys to making money in a good year. And I think if people aren't interested in that, that's okay. But I think, in my way of thinking, that changes the view of who would participate and who wouldn't, because it's actually within the farming system, not just selling it to an electricity dude that's going to sell it to make some money. So people said to me, oh, can we get some cheap electricity? Well, maybe, but it's still too hard. I'm not going to put a separate meter and run a line out, 40 k's to your place, mate. Like, how are you going to get cheap electricity out of it? It just doesn't work. In this case, you just put it in a truck and take your urea home. So, yep. But good question. I thought that question would come up.
With the straw, some years ago, we had blokes ringing us up, oh, we want to bale your straw and whatever. Anyway, we ended up getting $30 a tonne. They probably got it 50, baling it up, because we never had our own gear and whatever.
Yep.
The agronomists worked out we losing $30 at $45 a tonne in mineral and fertiliser stuff that was in that straw. We're getting bugger all for it, so it's going to be the same scenario, isn't it?
Oh, in this case, I would see if you delivered the straw, you'd get your ash back. And if it's in a co-op that's managed not to necessarily make a profit, but to make sure it's got running capital and, can run, but not necessary to make a profit, then the nutrients that he's valuing could come back. Now, you're going to have a price to move those nutrients and bring them back, so there's going to be a freight price. I guess we're not saying that the straw should be sold at any price. What we're saying is, what price do you think it should be to get a tonne of urea? And if that's $500, great, but it's not going to happen. If it's $20, you're probably doing yourself no favours either. So what is the real number? We're not trying to say what that number is. What we're looking for feedback today is, what is that number? Well, we don't need it today, over the next year, or till the end of this year, or whenever. This is what we want to find out, is what is that number? So I agree with you. There's different people doing different things, and we need to value that straw properly, but I don't know what that number is. We can plug that number in to the models and then plug in all the technology costs of the model and say whether this will work or how much the cash has to be, but we don't want to set that straw number. We want you guys to tell us what that straw number is over time, and that'll probably be a range. Some people go, $30, and some people go $100, $50, whatever. So then we can do a sensitivity analysis. If it was at this, what would be the cash you'd have to pay? If it was at that, what would the cash you'd have to pay? Our job isn't to convince anyone to cut their straw per se. It's to say, look, if you want to put it into this system to get urea, you tell us what you think that opportunity cost is. So it's just a bit of a different angle, I guess. So yeah, but I understand your question for sure.
Can all the ash be put back into the urea so there's no transport needed to get rid of that?
The answer is yes. So you could make like a urea trace element granule. I think at the plant you'd want to decide whether you want to do all urea like that, because some people might say I want to dissolve mine in water and put it through a nozzle or whatever, but there wouldn't be any drama in making pure ash pellets, pure urea pellets, and doing some urea plus ash pellets. And I guess what we would come back if we did this scoping study is to say, if you just get urea pellets and ash pellets, it's going to cost this. If you want the extra bit, it's an extra $5 or $5 million or whatever it is, and say, okay, these are the options. The same goes when people say, oh, we want UAN, not urea. That's great. We can price the urea plant, then we can price in doing a nitric acid to UAN plant and say, okay, maybe we stage that. You build urea first, get on top of that, and then you put the nitric acid plant in. So again, that's not going to be us saying which one's the better way to go. It's you guys telling us, do we want urea or do we want UAN or both? Or are we happy to stay with urea for 5 years while we get on top of the plant getting paid off and in the system, and then we'll do it as a stage 2. No, but good questions, Clemmy, thanks. Anyone else?
UAN, like in Mount Gambier, that they put carbon in, do you understand that? It's not as concentrated urea in that, but they say it's carbon in it. And
Not sure. I mean, if they're fulvic acids, so like humic acids and formic acids are still a form of carbon. Some of those acids can help the uptake through the leaf. So I wouldn't suggest it's adding that carbon for nutritional value per se. It's about uptake of it, I reckon. Yep. Alrighty. Anyway, we'll have time afterwards to chat. If anyone, wants to ask, something a bit quieter later on, we'll be here. So, yep. Thanks, James.
Okay, so I've tried to do some numbers around this, just so perhaps you can understand the effect of farm on a financial sense. Just running through some of the savings, and we've covered most of these off, but the key ones I'll probably just point out is obviously local freight and cartage, use of your own feedstock. So effectively, this should become like a second crop from your wheat crop in this case. Also, no currency exposure, right? So you're cutting out a whole bunch of geopolitical swings out by producing locally, and then that's going to flow through into your bottom line. Okay, and again, more discretion and these sorts of things. So if you've got local supply, it's ready there and available, you can make a choice much more closer to a weather event or whatever as to whether you're going to apply or not. You don't have to pre-buy, commit. So there's some upsides with that, which we'll run through. So we took a really basic assumption: wheat, 1,200 hectares, yield, urea price of 1,000 a tonne, and your conversion rates in line with what Greg was going through. So 4 tonne to 1 tonne of urea. And if we plug that in, right, when we try then look at what is going to be the cost of actually generating the straw. So we're sort of coming back to some of the questions here. So if we go and purchase it, we just pick $120 a tonne. Freight cost is the same. Contracted, you might have your own rates with local people, perhaps $65 a tonne. And internally funded, depending if you're already running hay producing kit in your stable, you're either going to go buy that kit and over sort of a 10-year period. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be fancy or anything. All it's doing is bundling straw and taking it down to the local spot. You might have about a $40 a tonne, right? Because your overhead costs, like we said before, they're already fixed, they're already there. So all you're doing now is getting out in a slow period through the year, cutting through the straw, baling it. You could probably share farm. Someone pulls the short straw in the 3 or 4 farmers locally. Someone does 1,000 hectares for everyone, and you swap every year, right? You get enough for what you need to produce, and then you switch it into your P&L. And you go, okay, well, if I can get it, this is on the $40 a tonne, this is the lowest possible, and I've got to go to the urea shop down the road, and I'm either paying $1,000 a tonne on the left-hand side, or I'm using my internal cost of straw plus $300 a tonne as a changeover cost, call it, then this is what's happening here. Okay, we've got the urea cost dropping substantially. There's an uprating here as, assuming a high rainfall year or whatever in terms of yield. So there's 3 different yield scenarios. And then we've got our gross profit increasing. All right. So that is dropping straight down to the bottom line. So that's the reason why you'd be doing it, because if you can acquire any sort of input cost for a lower price, it is going to reduce your hurdle rate to break even, which is Farm Resilience 101. And then it's going to fall down to your bottom line. Okay, obviously rough numbers there, but you can see that effect. So that's effectively the reason you have a lower, potentially local plant. All right, and here's what I call the cost delta. So delta, just difference. What's the gap? So you can see here on this side that we have a larger gap for a price variance where you can lower that cost. So purchased straw, you've only got that $200 a tonne variance. So as soon as urea gets back down to $800 a tonne, you're breaking even. You've got that higher delta if it can be pushed into your farming system. So if it comes into the way you produce on farm, you're going to have a much bigger gap, and therefore, an annual benefit of 100 grand a year. Okay, in theory. Again, as Greg said, this is conceptual as to whether or not you can get a plant that's producing. Right, if that $300 a tonne conversion goes up to 400 or 500, you've obviously going to drop that delta, but that's the gap you've got to work with effectively. All right, so hopefully that makes sense, but that's just the financials running through. So then, of course, there's 2 or 3 ways of looking at this. If you're not having to commit so much, then you're not having to hold. At the end of the day, if you're going to commit to urea and pay for urea, you've got to take it out of the overdraft and sit on it, right? And there's been times, certainly in my group of clients, where they haven't used it because it wasn't there. So yeah, you'll use it eventually, but you've got to hold that, right? You've got to hold that cost throughout the year. So we should also have, lower price volatility, higher margins over time, which is really important. There's access. So again, we've just had that shock. What if you couldn't get urea this year? What if the war continued and the boat stopped? And exactly what's just transpired here, we've had 4 inches of rain or whatever it is, you can't put it out. So what's the opportunity cost of not having it available? All right. And as I've mentioned to the other groups, I was on the Agribusiness Australia CEOs committee a couple of times. We've gone through this a million times. What are the chances of it happening? Absolutely almost zero. What's the impact if it does happen? Catastrophic, right? You can't get crops off. You don't have diesel, you don't have fert. So being able to have that local production means that you can really be comfortable that if you have the need, you can go and get it and put it on the crop, and there's 420 grand gap. And we're utilising, the key here again, overheads, we're utilising more of what we've got. Okay, so we're taking downtime of plant and we're turning it into productive, lower cost fert, okay? And then of course that increased profitability means expansion, more technology, off-farm assets, whatever you want to do, but it's improving the overall position of that enterprise, that family group, okay? So I'm hoping that makes a bit of sense. Any sort of questions on that? If you haven't completed this survey, scan it in, and it's just a bit of a survey that we're looking to collate about people's thoughts on it. How much urea you're using, what do you think? So take a picture if you like. And oh, perfect. Yeah, I don't know, any other questions or thoughts, feelings?